I sat inside a private dining room 30 floors above downtown Seattle, watching rain slide down the glass while my husband calmly negotiated the theft of my life. The restaurant was the kind of place where servers moved so quietly they seemed to appear out of the walls, serving courses on polished black ceramic plates. Reed had chosen it because he wanted to impress Callie Vance, the Tokyo investment executive sitting across from us. He claimed she was here to help expand modern boutique hotels across Asia. What he had not mentioned was that she had already been inside my home, inside my company. And judging by the way his eyes lingered on her hands, deep inside my marriage. "Try the grilled salmon, sweetheart," Reed said, lifting a bite toward my mouth with his chopsticks while keeping his voice soft and patient for our audience. That was something I had learned about calculated cruelty over the last year. The most practiced kind rarely sounds cruel in public. It sounds deeply concerned, finishes your sentences, adjusts your coat, and tells total strangers that you are tired before you even have a chance to speak. I opened my mouth and accepted the bite while Reed smiled at Callie as if he deserved an award for feeding me. "Callie has had some difficult days lately," Reed explained, placing his hand gently over mine in a gesture that looked affectionate. To anyone watching from another table, memory lapses, sudden confusion, nothing serious, we hope, but I try not to overwhelm her with business these days. His fingers tightened around my wrist just enough to deliver a silent warning beneath the table. I looked down at my plate, counted 3 slow breaths, and quietly told him that I still understood the company I spent 2 decades building from scratch. He chuckled softly and told me I only deserved to rest. Callie offered me a polished, practiced smile, her cream-colored suit looking impossibly sharp under the warm lighting. "Your properties are highly admired across Asia, Mrs. Vance," she said in flawless English, "particularly the historical restoration work you finished in Oregon." I thanked her calmly, mentioning that I had spent nearly 10 years in Kyoto studying traditional timber architecture before I ever opened my first location. Reed laughed lightly, telling her that those years were a lifetime ago, and that I seemed to remember ancient history much better than I remembered yesterday. Callie smiled wider, turned toward him, and immediately switched to fluent Japanese, asking if I always talked about the past whenever I felt nervous. Reed answered in the same language, his pronunciation clumsy but clear enough to understand, saying that I talked about whatever made me feel important. My heart gave one hard beat against my ribs. Reed knew I had lived abroad years ago, but he genuinely believed I had worked exclusively through American translators. I had never corrected him during our marriage because when I once ordered dinner in Kyoto, he simply laughed and said my accent sounded charming. The truth was that I had spent years negotiating commercial leases in Osaka, arguing complex construction terms in Nagoya, and sitting through endless late-night boardrooms where I learned exactly what people meant when they softened a threat with a polite smile. Callie lifted her sake cup, asking how many more weeks it would take before the court evaluation was finalized. Reed glanced at me while I allowed my gaze to drift toward the rain outside, pretending to be completely lost in my own foggy world. He told her the medical expert was submitting his formal report next week. Reed added that the report confirmed my cognitive symptoms were progressing exactly as expected, especially since he had increased my daily medication 4 days ago. Callie let out a soft laugh, mentioning how he had told her I called our housekeeper by the dog name yesterday. They both looked over at me, so I picked up my water glass and intentionally let my hand shake until a few drops spilled onto the white tablecloth. Reed reached over, performing patient concern for Callie while his thumb pressed hard into my wrist, warning me in English to be careful before returning to Japanese. He told Callie that 2 more public incidents would be enough for the court to grant him emergency legal authority, allowing him to approve the takeover. Something cold settled deep inside my chest, not a violent panic, but the quiet stillness that happens when love finally runs out of excuses. For months, I had been losing control of my own life, forgetting simple appointments, waking up with blinding headaches, and stumbling on stairs I had walked for years. Reed was always right there beside me with another pill, another glass of water, and another gentle reminder that I was aging. I had begun to fear my own mind, and fear makes a person easy to manipulate. Once you stop trusting your memory, you begin borrowing someone else's version of reality, and Reed had made sure his was the only version available to me. Callie remarked that $24 million was far too generous for a buyout when the real estate alone was worth $70 million. Reed replied that it would not matter once he controlled the voting rights, because the board already believed I was declining, and he would claim the business needed immediate liquidity to cover my long-term specialized care. When Callie asked where he planned to place me, Reed took a slow sip of his drink and mentioned a locked memory facility near the mountains, far enough away that no one would visit often. Callie inspected me like a piece of old furniture scheduled for removal, remarking how strange it was that a woman could build a real estate empire only to end up sitting quietly while others divided it up. Reed smiled, whispering that soon I would not even remember what I used to own. That was the moment I understood the true structure of their plan. The affair stung, but deep betrayal is rarely just about another woman. It is about the private contempt that makes the betrayal possible in the first place. Reed did not just want someone else, he needed me entirely erased so he could feel entitled to everything I had earned. Some people cannot stand beside a strong partner without secretly plotting to inherit their strength after destroying them. I intentionally let my silver spoon slip from my fingers, sending it clattering sharply against the ceramic plate. Reed turned instantly, his eyebrows raised in practiced alarm as he called my name. I blinked slowly at him, apologizing and saying my hand had simply lost its grip. He wiped a tiny drop of sauce from my sleeve, sighing heavily for Corey benefit as if caring for me had aged him by a decade. I gave Corey a weak, embarrassed smile, asking her to forgive me for being so tired tonight. She responded smoothly in English that there was nothing to forgive, but the moment Reed looked away to grab the bill, she leaned across the table and whispered in Japanese, telling me to enjoy these dinners while I still could not. I held her gaze for 1 second, allowing my eyes to lose focus so she would only see an aging woman fading away inside her own mind. What she did not see was the sharp architect who had once stood in a freezing Kyoto warehouse, watching contractors try to hide structural damage behind polite bowing. I had learned back then that people reveal their real intentions when they believe the least important person in the room cannot understand them. Before I reveal what happened when we returned home, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, and subscribe if you have ever seen silence mistaken for weakness. Dinner concluded with Reed signing the receipt using my company credit card. At the elevator, he wrapped my coat around my shoulders, promising Corey he would forward my confidential medical files in the morning. As the elevator doors slid open, he leaned close to my ear and whispered in Japanese one last time that in a few more weeks, I would no longer be his problem. I turned toward him with the exact confused expression he expected, asking if he had said something to me. Relief washed over his face as he told me it was nothing important. He guided me inside the elevator, completely unaware that those 4 words had just become the costliest mistake of his life. The cab descended in silence, but the woman reflected in the polished brass doors was no longer the helpless victim Reed thought he was bringing home. He saw a fragile wife leaning against the wall, clutching her purse as if she had forgotten its contents. I saw a survivor calculating how long her husband had been poisoning her mind before he became arrogant enough to brag about it. Over dinner, Corey stood beside us, checking her phone with the calm ease of someone who thought the hard work was already done. When the doors opened into the quiet garage, Reed placed a firm hand on my back, guiding me toward the car while warning me to walk slowly because the floor might be slick. It was completely dry, but calculated concern becomes a deadly weapon when it is repeated constantly in front of witnesses. Every gentle warning suggested I was slipping, and every hand on my elbow signaled to the world that I could no longer be trusted with my own balance. By the time a person is declared unfit, the people around them have usually been rehearsing the story for months. Corey Driver was waiting beside a dark sedan, and Reed embraced her with professional restraint, though his hand remained at her waist a moment longer than necessary. She reminded him in English to send the paperwork before 10 tomorrow morning, then turned to tell me it was lovely meeting me. I looked directly at her and asked if it really was. Her expression tightened for a split second before Reed turned toward me too quickly. I immediately let my face soften into mild confusion, adding that I meant the restaurant was lovely, allowing Corey to smile again, though far less comfortably this time. Reed insisted on driving us home because he always claimed hired drivers made me anxious, but the truth was much simpler. A private vehicle gave him absolute control over where we went, who heard us, and how the evening was later reported to doctors. As we drove through downtown Seattle, the city lights blurred across the wet windshield in long streaks of gold and red. For several miles, Reed said nothing, his jaw set tight while both hands remained gripped on the steering wheel. I could tell he was replaying the dinner, searching for any small detail in my behavior that did not fit the version of me he had carefully constructed. Guilty people always become obsessed with minor details, watching for a delayed reaction, a sharp glance, or a question asked too clearly. Innocent people rarely study you that closely because they have nothing to hide. I waited until we crossed the long bridge over the water before calling his name softly. He exhaled sharply through his nose, asking what I wanted. I kept my voice hesitant, mentioning that Corey had said something about 2 weeks and a locked room. The car drifted slightly over the lane line before he quickly jerked the wheel back into place. He did not answer right away, and that brief silence told me more than a full confession ever could. A truthful person reaches for basic facts, while a liar immediately reaches for emotional control. Reed lowered his voice into that familiar, sad tone. telling me I was doing this again by taking random fragments of conversation and turning them into something terrifying. He reminded me that I had done the exact same thing last week when I accused our housekeeper of moving my corporate files out of my home office. I told him firmly that my files had indeed been moved, but he replied without hesitation that I had moved them myself into the hallway cabinet. I remembered that morning vividly, having woken up with a migraine so intense that bright light felt like sharp glass against my eyes. Reed had walked into the room carrying a box of legal documents, claiming he found them hidden behind a stack of bath towels. At the time, I felt overwhelming shame. Because memory loss carries a quiet humiliation that leaves you entirely dependent on the honesty of whoever remembers things for you. If that person is actively lying, your own mind becomes the prison they lock you inside. I feigned defeat, murmuring that perhaps I really was more exhausted. Then I realized. His shoulders visibly relaxed as he told me I was simply overwhelmed, which was why he kept urging me to step back from the hotel business entirely. When I asked if he meant stepping back from everything, he reached over to squeeze my knee, telling me to let him carry the heavy burden. For a while, that gesture might have comforted me months ago, but now I understood he was not offering to carry my weight, he was waiting for me to hand over the keys to my life. I asked him point blank if Corey had been discussing a specialized care facility during dinner. Reed withdrew his hand, his voice growing firmer, as he claimed she was merely discussing a new hospitality development project near the mountains. It was a clever lie because it recycled a nearby truth, taking real details from our company portfolio to make the fabrication feel authentic. When I asked about the judge, Reed hit the brakes harder than necessary. At a red light, turning toward me as the soft concern completely drained from his face, he told me in a low, cold voice that there was no judge, no locked room, and no secret conversation. He insisted I was imagining threats because I refused to accept what was naturally happening to my aging brain. I held his gaze, asking him what he honestly believed was happening to me. The light turned green, but the driver behind us had to honk before Reed finally hit the gas. He looked straight ahead, telling me I was terrified because I knew my mind was failing, and instead of facing reality, I was projecting blame onto the only people trying to protect me. It was almost brilliant how he turned my valid suspicion into proof of my supposed illness. If I argued, I was paranoid; if I became angry, I was unstable; if I stayed silent, I was confused. He had built a mental trap with no visible exit, fully expecting me to spend the rest of my life trying to prove I belonged outside of it. He added that our private physician, Dr. Thorne, agreed I should sign temporary medical and financial power of attorney documents just until we figured out what was wrong. When I asked if he had already spoken to the doctor without me, Reed replied smoothly that of course he had, because he was my husband and I kept forgetting my scheduled appointments. I had never missed a single appointment in my life until Reed began managing my daily calendar. I turned toward the window, letting my lips tremble slightly as I quietly apologized. The shift in his energy was instantaneous, his cold anger melting back into warm relief as he took my hand, telling me I never had to apologize as long as I just trusted him. Trust had become the curtain bad people pulled down when they did not want you seeing what was happening behind the stage. I left my hand in his until we pulled up to our home in Queen Anne, a striking dark cedar structure overlooking the bay that I had lovingly restored 14 years ago. Reed parked in the garage, instructing me to stay put until he came around to open my door. I obeyed, letting him guide me through the kitchen, switch on the hallway lights, and ask if I still remembered where our main bedroom was located. I feigned embarrassment, asking if he really thought I had forgotten our room, but at the bottom of the staircase, I intentionally hesitated and placed my foot on the wrong step, catching the railing as if I had completely misjudged the height. A tiny flash of genuine satisfaction lit up his eyes before his worried expression returned. That split-second reaction confirmed everything I needed to know. He did not fear my physical and mental decline, he desperately needed it to happen. So he could take everything. He told me to head upstairs while he brought up my nightly supplements and a glass of water. I replied that I wanted to sit in my old drafting room for a few minutes first to look for something. Suspicion immediately sharpened his eyes as he asked what I could possibly be looking for late at night. I blinked slowly, telling him I could not quite remember, which made him let out a quiet laugh before telling me I had 5 minutes before bed. He walked toward the kitchen, already pulling out his phone, while I walked down the quiet hallway without rushing. The drafting room had once been my sanctuary where I spent nights reviewing building schematics, but Reed considered it an obsolete space filled with relics of my past self. I closed the door and walked over to a heavy lacquered wooden chest I had imported from an artisan in Kyoto decades ago. Behind the bottom drawer was a hidden compartment that no one else in the house knew existed. Inside rested my original passport, a leather journal, a photo of my daughter Vance, and a secure burner phone my former corporate security director, Marisol Vega, had insisted I keep years ago. I picked up the photograph first, looking at Vance standing outside our flagship Oregon hotel on opening day, laughing as the ceremonial ribbon snapped early in the wind. Reed had spent the last 6 months convincing me that Vance had stopped calling because she was furious about her trust fund allocation, claiming she felt entitled to the business. I had accepted his explanation back when my mind felt constantly clouded and every emotional conversation exhausted me. But now I saw the truth. Isolation does not begin by locking someone in a room, it begins by telling them a lie that is easier to swallow than the heartbreak of being targeted. I powered on the secure phone and dialed Marisol number directly from memory. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice cautious until I spoke her name. A heavy silence fell over the line before I heard the scrape of a chair, followed by her asking where I had been for the last 4 months. She told me Reed had informed the entire board that I had officially retired and explicitly requested no further contact from former staff. I closed my eyes as the massive scale of his deception settled between us. I kept my voice to a low whisper, telling Marisol that my husband was actively attempting to have me declared mentally incompetent with the help of a foreign investor, and that I believed he was systematically poisoning my food to simulate dementia. Marisol breath hitched, her polite tone instantly disappearing and being replaced by the sharp, formidable focus that had once terrified opposing legal teams in court. She asked if I had hard physical evidence yet, and when I told her not yet, she explicitly instructed me not to confront him, not to sign a single document, and never to swallow anything he handed me. Footsteps echoed softly down the hardwood hallway as Reed approached the room. I turned toward the door, whispering into the receiver that I needed her to discreetly contact our chief legal counsel and a private forensic pathologist immediately. The door handle began to turn, so I hastily added that she needed to trace every financial transfer Reed had made over the past 6 months and identify what substance he was putting into my body. I ended the call, slipped the phone back into the hidden compartment, and opened my journal just as Reed walked in carrying a glass of water and 3 pale blue capsules in his palm. He offered a gentle smile, telling me it was time for my medicine, and as I looked at the man I had loved for 20 years, I realized that surviving him would require far more than simple courage, it would require absolute discipline.